Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to this CARLA presentation. My name is Kate Paisani, and I work at CARLA. So we are delighted today to have James Ramsburg and Yoko Hama here to present. They are both PhD students in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at the University of Minnesota, studying Hispanic linguistics. And James and Yoko were also recipients of a CARLA summer research assistantship to be able to support the project that they're going to talk about today. And the title of their talk is Acquisition of Discourse Markers and Fillers in L2 Spanish and Their Usage in Spontaneous Conversation. So take it away, James and Yoko.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Yoko and I are very excited to be here today. As Kate mentioned, this is the product of our research assistantship that we got this summer with Dr. Mandy Mankey, and we're very excited to share it with you all. So here we go. So again, we're looking at the acquisition of discourse markers and fillers in L2 Spanish. So discourse markers are known to be an essential part of oral and written production of fluid structured discourse. And what we wanted to do then was to see how advanced Spanish learners, advanced undergrad Spanish learners, did or did not produce discourse markers in their speech. And although discourse markers and other related features can be crucial for coherent and fluid communication, there's relatively few studies that have been done on them, and especially in L2 Spanish. So that is the gap that we're looking to fill, and it's sought to fill with our research.
And before we start talking about discourse markers and fillers, we would like to kind of problematize the idea of advancedness a little bit, because so there are several ways to measure how advanced one is as a second language learner, such as actual proficiency guidelines and the common European framework of reference for languages. And actual focuses more on the oral proficiency based on interviews, and there are other ways to examine the advancedness by the traditional idea of advancedness, so such as academic context or written forms. But we believe that advancedness is there is no clear cut line for somebody who is advanced and somebody who is not, but it is very complicated and multidimensional, and we would have to consider various aspects such as sophistication or range of the language and other extra linguistic factors like working memory or motivation, and maybe length of residency in a country, or contact with native speakers as well. So for this presentation, we are not talking about advancedness in general in a big picture, but we would like to focus more on the pragmatic side of proficiency. And fluency is also kind of could be arbitrary term, but so Balazek book and her colleagues showed that typical speaker experiences more unfilled pauses in their second language than speaking in their native language, and that fluent speakers pause less often, but also they know how to pause in a right juncture in an utterance. So learning when and how often to pause, filled or unfilled, even though pausing might, some people might think that pausing equals disfluency, but pausing and either unfilled or filled, they might serve very important functions in natural conversation. So they are beneficial when a speaker aspires to acquire native-like speech fluency. And we would also like to think about the how we examine near native proficiency, and so there are some aspects of proficiencies that contribute to the acquisition. But traditionally, it was thought that age of onset is the most important aspect of so near native proficiency, because pre-puberty age would be most, so they are typically thought to be crucial to be able to acquire second language to near native level. And there's also this idea of fossilization after achieving certain level. But there are many other aspects that should be examined, such as social, psychological, experiential, and instructional variables for native-like attainment. And also performance in multimodal context should be analyzed, because so near-native competence might be something that is temporary rather than permanent, because it depends on the context or audience or medium. So we would have to think about the specific situation.
Great. And so we have these concepts of fluency, of advancedness, so these complex concepts with varying definitions. We're going to, complicate that even a little further with interlanguage pragmatics. And so that is, very in short, the study of how second language learners comprehend and produce speech acts, manage conversations, organize discourse, choose forms of address, use pragmalinguistic resources. And while the field has been criticized for a lack of attention to pragmatics in SLA, some correlations have been established between the two disciplines. And so, for example, the attainment of pragmatic knowledge, which would be the ability to adequately use language in different communicative situations, is essential to the development of communicative competence, right? So from Canelli and Swain. To achieve this competence, then speakers utilize an array of pragmalinguistic resources, right? Language resources used for pragmatic ends to convey the appropriate meanings in context. However, and here's where the problem arises, is that these resources are not acquired simultaneously, right? Learners do not simply download all of their pragmalinguistic resources and are able to use them all at once. And so the second language user must learn to manage them as their interlanguage develops. And so in the beginning stages of acquisition, the L2 learner relies on one form for one function, it's the one-to-one principle, before transitioning to making choices between multiple forms for the same function. So that's the Anderson 1990 there. And this shift from the one-to-one principle to multifunctionality is exemplified in the acquisition of discourse markers as well. And so, for example, I like to use the example of entonces and luego. A Spanish learner may initially only know the word entonces, which is then or so, as a mean of connecting two units of discourse. And while that's straightforward, at this stage, the speaker may overuse that marker, and thus their speech may be pragmatically inappropriate from the perspective of a native speaker. And as their linguistic competence increases, then the learner acquires luego. They learn the word luego, which is a functionally equivalent particle for connecting discourse. So at this stage, the learner now has the ability to vary their usage of connectives, increasing their pragmatic abilities, but they're also faced with a challenge, and that's the difficulties of utilizing them in a pragmatically appropriate manner. So now they have two markers, but they have to know when to use them. Can they use them interchangeably? Is there a context in which one is better than the other? And that's where the complexity of it arises. And so this study of how second language speakers manage these emergent contrasts adds context to how the pragmatic system develops in relation to other elements of linguistic competence. And so discourse markers then are one of these such pragmalinguistic resources. They can be called discourse particles, they can be all pragmatic markers, but they're functional items. They're functional classic linguistic mechanisms that signal the potential communicative intentions of the speaker. And they do not change, usually, the propositional content, if they're functional, but they're fundamental for structuring discourse because they indicate speakers' attitudes towards the proposition, towards the express content, and facilitate the processes of pragmatic inferences. They facilitate communication, and that is their that's their overall function, is they make communication easier. And so for the ones that we use in this study, I mean, there's many different typologies of discourse markers. The one we've decided to go with is one from Martin Zorraquino and Portoles Lázaro, who uses a 5-type typology. There's ones that are used for structuring information. In Spanish, that'd be something like primero or último, right, first, last. Connecting ideas, so connectors, things like además, también, entonces, luego, the ones that I just mentioned. Reformulating segments, so reformulating your ideas. You want to say something a little bit different. That's like things like o sea, that is, es decir, I mean, etc. Managing discourse. Things like por ejemplo, for example, it's a common one. And then what we'll see as being very important to this presentation is conversational markers, those that facilitate conversation, things you'll say like, oh, claro, of course.
And fillers like or in speech are often ignored, if not frowned upon, especially in a formal situation, because overuse of fillers can give off negative impressions of the speaker, such as being insecure or too informal. For example, Diaz Ochoa and other scholars like him have attributed the overuse of worthless fillers to poor lexical knowledge, and they should be eliminated from speech as much as possible. But in a casual conversation, adequate use of fillers can help the listener to sort out the speech and ignore misleading information, even if the speech is interrupted. And fillers are often referred to as crutch words, and muletilla in Spanish means the same thing, which we believe that metaphorically shows the supporting role they play in everyday speech to facilitate. So fillers are also discourse markers in that sense. And so fillers can mark a hesitation of the speaker, indicating the thinking process of the speaker in the following utterance. And they can also maintain the flow of a conversation by filling a pause that otherwise might turn out to be awkward silence. And fillers signal that the speaker is willing to still hold the floor in the sense of conversation, even if they may not know what exactly to say at the moment. And fillers are also used often to highlight reformulation of the utterance in case the speaker realizes that their utterance was not the most effective for their intended communication.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a bit about previous research related more directly to our context. So discourse markers have been widely studied, as I mentioned before, in English, in many other languages, including Spanish. And discourse markers in second language, usually in a pair with English and German, English and Dutch, English and Swedish, have been relatively widely studied. However, discourse markers in second language Spanish, what there is what's on the screen. And so most of it's been with the intermediate learners. And so starting with Fernandez in 1990, 1997, included some discourse markers in her error analysis of written texts, but pretty surface level. Nogueira in 2011 then was the first person to actually look at the oral production of intermediate learners and see what discourse markers that they were using. And she looked at Brazilian learners of Spanish and found that they were using discourse markers, and they were using them pretty frequently and actually very correctly. And the ones that they were using were ones that matched up with parallel markers in Portuguese. And so there was that bit of language transfer or influence from their L1, helping them to perform well, pragmatically in Spanish. And she compared then, and this is probably the more crucial finding, she compared what the discourse markers those learners were using to the textbooks that are commonly used to teach those learners, and found that discourse markers overwhelmingly are not present in instructional materials. And if they are, they were not the discourse markers needed or required, the ones that these learners were using in their everyday speech. So they weren't being taught the markers that they really needed to use at this level. And then Llanos and Gonzalez in 2014, it's in a way the study that this one is, our present study is based off of, used corpus, and they looked at B1 and B2 intermediate learners right on the SEFR scale compared to natives, and how they use discourse in oral speech, right, in an interview and a photo description task. And they found that discourse marker use increased from B1 to B2. There was development in the intermediate learner groups, but that it was not yet native-like, right, in frequency and in function. So in the types of markers they were using were not the same, were not native-like yet. In terms of advanced learners, we have De La Fuente in 2009, was not a production study or a study that looked at spontaneous speech. It was experimental, and what they wanted to do was to look at and see, okay, how do you best teach discourse markers? And so two groups, one was taught them explicitly, one was taught them implicitly, and then they did a recall assessment task and found that significantly, for the group that was taught explicitly was significantly better at recalling and retaining, right, a short list of discourse markers. So evidence that discourse markers should be taught explicitly. And then in a previous study, that again, a pilot study that Yoko and I did, and that's forthcoming, I found that in a similar corpus to Llanos and Gonzalez, one of advanced learner speech, corresponding to about C1 on the SEFR scale, that those advanced learners, when compared to native speakers in the same corpus, use discourse markers in a native-like way. They've achieved, at least at the superficial level, a native-like use of discourse markers in frequency and in function and in overwhelmingly similar ways. And so there's conflicting evidence, right? Maybe advanced learners can do this, maybe they can't, but again, advancedness itself is a very wide-ranging and diverse concept.
And fillers have not been generally studied very intensively previously, but there are some previous studies. So Basurto Santos and colleagues, as well as Crystal, have identified two types of pauses in speech. So it is either filled or unfilled. So meaning unfilled pauses are just silence. And fillers that fill the pauses have two categories based on main functions. One type is fillers with expletive functions, and speakers use this type of fillers to avoid a silent pause or hesitation that could interrupt the flow of utterance. And another type is fillers with communicative functions that can signal sequences or check the understanding of the listener. And according to them, there is a great overlap of these two types of fillers. And Bestard Revilla points out the importance of adequate usage of fillers adopted by university instructors, because appropriate use of fillers can be advantageous in communication in academic context in order to organize and emphasize certain ideas or check understanding of students. And Brennan and Schober, as I mentioned earlier, claim fillers used at the right moment and with the right frequency are useful in communication, but also overuse may cause disfluency. The rate of disfluency may differ based on social groups or how familiar the speaker is about the topic, but high disfluency causes listeners to have a continuation problem because upon listening, they must edit disfluencies mentally to process the information in the speech. And fillers also have not been a focus of second language. Clicks, we also include clicks as a type of filler, discourse markers as well. So Pinto and Vigil, professors at St. Thomas University, so explored the usage of clicks by Spanish native speakers. So they were native speakers of Peninsular Spanish. And they demonstrated that clicks, even though they lack semantic content or and very instantaneous, they also are useful to signal word searches or certain stance taking by the speaker, such as dissatisfaction. So we put one sentence that was uttered in the data of native speakers, but so it's a passé. So the copyright mark is the, we use it for a click, dental click. So passé, no sé, and he continued, right? And so fillers have not been a focus of second language acquisition that much either. As pointed out by Arenas Nunez, who examined textbooks for instructions regarding the use of fillers, and found out that fillers are commonly neglected in textbooks and classrooms. And Balazic, Bulk, and the colleagues have stated that it is crucial for second language learners to know the adequate frequency and usage in order to speak more fluently in the target language. And Basurto Santos and colleagues have reported that students of L2 English in Mexico tended to use Spanish fillers such as bueno, este, and entonces, even while they spoke English in a classroom. So our current study is partially inspired by our impression that some advanced students still used L1 so English fillers in their conversations. So we actually wanted to record the conversations and quantify that.
Okay, and so now talking or switching gears to talk about our current study, I have a couple of research questions, and those are, do advanced learners, advanced undergraduate learners, those would be considered advanced, utilize discourse markers in a similar frequency and in similar context as native speakers? Are the types of discourse markers used and preferred by advanced learners similar to the ones preferred by native speakers? And then is there L1 lexical transfer from English in the discourse markers of L2 Spanish?
So as I was mentioning with Kate before this presentation, we had some difficulty finding participants, but we managed to have 4 participants for each group, which are, so the first group is native speakers of Spanish from different regions like Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Spain. And they all have lived in the US for at least half a year. And the second group is graduate students of Hispanic or Spanish studies, and they are also graduate instructors of Spanish at university level. So they use Spanish daily and professionally, and they are all US-born English native speakers. And they all have had study abroad experience. And the third group is the undergraduate students. So they are all aspiring to be Spanish minors. And they have completed or currently enrolled in a class for advanced speakers who have passed proficiency exam. So beyond the 4th semester of study in Spanish, but they have not had any study abroad experience previously.
And in terms of our analysis then, so what we did is we took our participants and we had them participate in a spontaneous conversation, as our title suggests. And that was a spontaneous open-ended conversation. They could talk about whatever they wanted. And so they were paired and then recorded on Zoom, and they talked anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes. 20 minutes for the graduate students and the native speakers and 30 minutes for the undergrads. And that was just due to the differences in how much speech they're going to produce, right? The more competent speakers are going to produce a lot more speech, and so try and normalize the amount of discourse they're producing. That was the reason for the time difference. Then after those were recorded, they were transcribed very graciously by Yoko, and then analyzed quantitatively. And in total, we have 1,800 tokens, discourse markers, fillers, and clicks. And we looked at the frequency of those, the variety of which ones were being used in different, the different classes and types of discourse markers, which ones were preferred, or what are the individual repertoires of our participants, and then again looking at L1 lexical transfer. And so in our results, very globally, there's 2 main patterns that emerge. One is that the native speakers in the graduate student group are very, very similar in their usage of discourse markers, fillers, and clicks. And that's in frequency and in typologically similar patterns. So similar to my forthcoming study with advanced learners in the corpus, same idea, using them same way, very, very similar ways. The second pattern is that, in contrast, the undergraduate student group underutilized discourse markers and instead overutilized fillers and clicks in quite striking ways. And so we're going to go through our results then by discourse markers, fillers, and clicks separately. Do want to reiterate, though, that all of this is sort of a Russian nesting doll, in that they're all discourse markers, right? So fillers are discourse markers, clicks we see as discourse markers, but we're separating them out for ease and so you all can understand and see the patterns a bit better. So overall, globally with discourse markers, of those 5 classes I talked about earlier, we saw 4 of them. The only one that we didn't see were information structurers, things like primero or por último, right, first, last, those were not present. But we saw the other 4 groups. And overwhelmingly, as you can see on the very right there, conversational markers were the ones that were preferred. Overwhelmingly compared to the other groups. And that makes sense. It's spontaneous, casual conversation. Conversational markers are going to be pretty important. And that's also where you see the most stark contrast between the native and the graduate students using relatively the same amount of those markers, and the undergraduates really falling off and not using hardly any. Discourse operators were infrequent overall. Reformulators were relatively similar, and connectors as well. You know, we see the same pattern in connectors as with conversational markers, but it's just the, you know, way less number of those tokens, and the differences I think are less stark. So breaking those down by class, if we look at connectors, right, so things like entonces, luego we talked about earlier, also pero, just but, también and después. Again, those general patterns. Native speakers and graduate students are using all of these markers, right? So using a pretty good variety of markers and using them in relatively similar ways, right? They're both preferring entonces and pero the most. Then a CK is relatively equal. But you can see, so the red and the blue, there's a good distribution across the number of markers. The undergraduates, however, are using, you know, quite a few less, and they're reflecting, you know, in frequency, and they're relying on a fewer number of lexical items, a fewer number of discourse markers. So in showing that they haven't acquired or perhaps don't feel comfortable using the whole gamut of connectors that would be possible for this communicative situation, you know, they're relying on pero, they're relying on so, of course, being an English marker and not Spanish, etc. And so an example of connectors, and this is from one of the graduate students, and hopefully you can hear my sound. I have shared it, so please let me know if you cannot, but.
Y claro, y van a una escuela de inmersión de español, entonces hablamos español. Pero también es muy difícil, claro, porque todos tienen sus iPads de la escuela y están haciendo todos sus trabajos usando los iPads. Pero claro, por ejemplo, la chica de 5 años está aprendiendo cómo escribir las letras y es muy difícil como escribir usando el dedo porque no tienen los lápices para el iPad tampoco. Solo usan el dedo. Entonces, como empezar a escribir todas las letras con el dedo me hace muy difícil. Entonces, tienen que aprender. Y también tienen reuniones con los maestros y es muy difícil para ellos como prestar atención por tanto tiempo viendo una pantalla. Entonces, claro.
So yeah, so in that fragment, in this 50 seconds only, we see this grad student, so again, non-native speaker, although has a very high level of competency, obviously, using a lot of connectors to help move her narrative along about these iPads that these children are using. So using a lot of connectors and using a variety of them as well. So again, that's something typical, not only of graduate discourse, but of native discourse as well. In terms of reformulators, so again, things that one would use to say something a different way. O sea, it is, like, I mean, similar patterns. Same patterns sort of hold throughout this entire presentation. And that's that native and graduate students using similar markers in similar ways. And there are some differences. So o sea is preferred more by the natives, como is preferred more by the graduate students, and perhaps again that's due to the fact that como meaning like, answers that influence from English perhaps is coming into play there. And in contrast, our undergraduates not using hardly any reformulators, and when they do, it is the English like, right? So not even using one in Spanish, but relying on that English word, again, indicating that they simply do not have these resources at their disposal. However, they still, like any other speaker, need to reformulate their discourse. They need to say things in a different way. And here's a great example of like.
Excepto de no hay like comida rápida en y like cuando es muy tarde en la noche y todos toda la gente están borracho. Gente quiere like comida rápida.
Right, so here, and that was, I didn't say it before, but of course, an undergrad speaker, one of these potential, advanced speakers using, and again, a short, fragment. This one was what, I believe maybe 20, 30 seconds compared to the 50-second one we saw before, but referring or relying only on the use of like, instead of, in places where he could be using other reformulators. And an interesting little tidbit at the bottom of the screen is that this particular participant noted in the post-task survey that they knew that pero like was a discourse marker, and pero like is a sort of a marked, maybe an identity marker. It's characteristic of heritage Spanish. I mean, it's interesting that this speaker, who is not a heritage speaker, knew it, recognized it, perhaps heard it in popular culture, and said that was, that is a discourse marker. And he actually used it at one point in a different fragment. Again, the acquisition and the adoption of discourse markers that are perhaps identity markers as well by people who do not belong necessarily to those typical groups who would use them. So just an interesting tidbit. In terms of discourse operators, again, there were so few of them. I mean, if you look at this chart, we're going up to 10 instead of in the hundreds. So it's relatively insignificant. Patterns somewhat old. Native speakers used a lot of them, graduate students less, and undergraduates pretty much not at all, but there's only 2 of them. So less important overall, but they did show up. And then conversational markers, to go to the other end of the spectrum, the most important. And this isn't all of the conversational markers we saw. This is only those that were used more than 5 times. There's probably double the amount of these. So we're at 30 in total. But the patterns hold true. Natives and graduate students using similar markers in similar ways and using them quite frequently. However, with some differences, no being preferred by the natives, no, we have that in English as well, but sort of like right as well. I'd like to teach that class, right? For example, and then the graduate students preferring yeah, again, transfer from English. Native speakers, however, using a surprising amount of yeah as well. But if we look at the undergraduates, our supposedly advanced learners, they're using conversational markers. This is where they have the most variety. But if you take a look at which ones those are, they're all in English. Are all ones that at least have, if they exist in Spanish, they have parallels in English. So we have yeah, okay, oh, and ah, which are more sounds than anything. And then, a little bit of place, but not a lot. So again, indicating once more that they simply have not acquired the discourse markers that they could be using in these situations. But that doesn't mean they don't want to use the discourse markers, these conversational markers, or that they don't need to, because they need to structure their discourse and they need to react and participate in the conversation in that same way, because it's required of any sort of discourse, but they simply don't have them. And here then, again, this is from one of the graduate participants to show how these conversational markers are used.
Pero no sé, depende mucho del tema. A veces la gente estudia como un libro entero para la disertación o usan un libro como un capítulo y una obra de arte para otro capítulo, otro libro para otro capítulo. No sé, es como depende mucho de los materiales que uno quiere usar. Pero,
y para alguien que no esté familiarizado con la literatura, ¿cómo describirías tu tesis?
Ya, pues un poco lo mismo, supongo. Estoy trabajando con películas, entonces separo el tema, bueno, con subtemas, digo.
And so in here, graduate student speech, near native, very similar to native speech, using a lot of conversational markers in this short fragment and using a variety of them. And the interlocutor participating, right? Most of this was from one of those speakers, but the other partner in the conversation saying, signaling agreement. These are things that we do in conversation and that we need to do in conversation. And another interesting thing here as well is if we go back to that idea of multifunctionality, you can see here we have both pues and bueno, which in this context are both meaning well. But this speaker has, again, acquired a certain level of competence to know that I can use both of these. And I can use both of these perhaps correctly. I know when, in what context to use them, and when I can switch. And so, not relying so much on one marker, being able to vary their discourse, make it sound more natural, more pragmatically felicitous, etc. And then we'll skip that for time, and we'll go into fillers and clicks.
Yes, so we are including fillers and clicks as part of discourse markers, but for the sake of this study, we chose filler syllables. So it's either a vowel or a vowel plus nasalization at the end, meaning ending with so right. And so we categorize them. And so you can see that the yellow bar for undergraduate for fillers with nasalization, which is was very high. So more than 300 tokens we saw in the data, and the use of these filler syllables for native speakers and graduate students were pretty similar in a tendency. And so so in the yellow in the middle, it was very frequent for undergraduate students. And the one that was most frequent for native speakers was so prolonged so, and graduate students also use this but undergraduate students did not. And we would like to further investigate the phonological characteristics of the languages, but this might come from the difference of resting vowels between English and Spanish. And as Pinto and Vigil pointed out in their papers about clicks as discourse markers, clicks often accompany other discourse markers. So the majority of clicks come together with other types of discourse markers. So in the graduate data that we just listened to, there was one. So there was one with click and then como. Yes, and then so this makes sense for the undergraduate clicks because they said a lot, so the clicks also accompanied the ums. So that's why the 60 tokens were from the undergraduate students compared to the small amount of discourse of clicks from native speakers and graduate students. And here is an example from one of the undergraduate data. And yeah, we can listen to it.
Pero cuando estoy en Chipotle, comía el pollo y no es una opción vegetariano, pero me recuerdo de cuando está en el nivel 4 o 5, me trae sofritas y no sabe que está en tofu. Y estoy muy sorprendida de la sabor.
So as we could hear in this example, the and the pauses that come together, and sometimes the clicks that you can see in the transcript, so slow down the conversation, so meaning that it was causing disfluency and the information was not conveyed efficiently, as efficiently as the native or graduate student data. And we would also like to talk about some survey results. So after the task, survey results. So for undergraduate participants, so one of them has started studying Spanish at the age of 6, and the other 3 started studying from the age of 12 to 14. And we also are interested in the factor or the contribution that motivation makes in the native-like speech. So we included some like ultimate goal that you have for the Spanish learning in the survey. And we had options like, major in Spanish, or becoming a Spanish educator, or master's degree in Spanish, or becoming an educator in higher education, etc. But the only 3 options that they chose, so they're all minoring in Spanish, and they would all like to be able to communicate with native speakers in a daily conversation, and so 2 of them wanted to get a bilingual job after graduation, so to the professional level fluency. And we also included a question, so how important is it to you to pass for a native Spanish speaker? And since there are only 4 participants, we can't really give definite answers to the tendencies, but so 2 of them would like to pass as native Spanish speaker and be near native level, and 2 of them did not care as much. And so these were questions about the frequency of usage, or how what kind of medium they consume daily. So so at the time, the undergraduate students did not really use Spanish as much, so a few times every month or not at all. And so watching TV, movies, YouTube, or listening to music, so they were getting various degree of input. So every day, or once a week, or never. So there were different results for that question. And for graduate students, similarly, the age of onset was from 12 to 14, and the study abroad experience varied from 4 to 10 months, either in Spain or in Latin America. And the question about how important is it to you to pass for a native Spanish speaker, the results were maybe slightly different. So 3 of them wanted to pass as native speakers, and then 1 of them did not care at all. And so here's our discussion section. So for undergraduate participants, it is, so for connectors, for discourse markers, so entonces and pero are very frequently used in their natural conversation, but these 2 words are some of the first words that are taught in classrooms, so they hear it constantly. And the use of so was also very frequent in as connectors in their speech. And then reformulators, so as we saw, there was a frequent use of like, and other types of reformulators were rarely used. And there were conversational markers that they used most frequently were yeah, okay, oh. So discourse markers, so these are the discourse markers that are also found in English. So they probably still don't have that, idea of what conversational markers look like in Spanish. And so fillers and clicks were very frequent, especially a vowel and nasalization, and plus click. And they were also often accompanied by unfilled pauses, so they tend to slow down the conversation. But these so fillers and clicks were very useful to signal that the speaker is still willing to hold the floor in the conversation. So using discourse markers to put ideas together or show the sequences is still difficult to do for undergraduate participants.
And then for our graduate participants, as we've been mentioning, discourse markers, overall similar usage pattern to the native speakers. Connectors, they had a slightly less variety than the native speakers, but still relatively similar. Reformulators, their most preferred was como, most frequently used, possibly because it is that direct equivalent of like in English. And conversational markers, again, yeah was frequently used, but our native speakers also used yeah with relatively similar frequencies. Is this perhaps because they've been living in an English dominant context for a while? Again, the jury is out on what that effect could be. But overall, graduate participants use discourse markers in this study in a native-like manner, at least in frequency and in typologically similar ways. So to conclude, while the graduate student group and native speakers use discourse markers similarly, the undergraduate students did not, instead overusing fillers and clicks to manage their discourse. And this leads us to believe that perhaps discourse markers, and by extension, other elements of pragmatic competence, are linguistic structures acquired at the very late stages of acquisition. And so perhaps we should move from expecting discourse markers to be a part of advanced competency, and perhaps it's more realistic to think that they're more a feature of near native or native-like competency. Not to say that they cannot be part of advanced competency if they were taught and if they were introduced, but at least as it stands right now, near native is where it seems like these discourse markers are being fully acquired. And why does this all matter? It's a very good question. Because the goal is not to produce native-like speakers. That is not the ultimate goal. For this, again, someone cannot always be, a non-native speaker is never going to be a native speaker, right? My Spanish is always going to be influenced by English. And that's just a reality of being a multilingual learner, a multilingual speaker. Instead, however, discourse markers allow learners, allow speakers to be strategic communicators. So they allow them to facilitate their communication. That's what discourse markers do. That's what fillers and clicks do. They allow them to be understood better. And if you're understood better, then if you think, perhaps they can reach their goals, they can have access to other opportunities, they can perhaps use certain socially, indexable markers and facilitate access into an in-group. There's many different possibilities, but it's about helping learners to be strategic communicators and helping learners to facilitate their own communication. And future implications, just to finish off very, very quickly. We would argue for explicit instruction. Again, that's going back to the De La Fuente 2009 study, that it's just lexical acquisition. If you teach these words and you teach them explicitly, perhaps a little early on, you could create, right? You could perhaps move the marker back into advanced or even into intermediate for when these markers could be used and when these markers could be used proficiently. We would also be interested in doing a perception study. How marked are the discourse markers that aren't native-like? How marked is right? How marked is compared to M? Is that really something that is so shocking to the ear of a native speaker? What are the social implications of having native-like pragmatic abilities? Again, that's, do you get more social access or not? How does the goal and motivations of each learner impact this? Would they make more effort to imitate a native-like way of speech if they ultimately want to pass as a native speaker? And then different situations with different interlocutors. So we have an idea about mirroring or about a priming effect, right? If one interlocutor is using a marker, is there a positive feedback loop that makes me want to use it, etc. So lots of ways to go, but that is all for today. We have a lot of references, and we thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, James and Yoko. I know you didn't have a lot of subjects and you had trouble getting them, but this is really interesting. And it's nice that you had parallel number of subjects across the three groups that you were looking at. I just wanted to make one comment. There are several questions in the chat as well, but your recommendation to explicitly teach these kinds of discourse markers, I think, is really important, because one of the things that is lacking from instruction in not just in Spanish, but in other second languages is a focus on naturalistic discourse, how conversations take place, what they look like, how native speakers sound when they're speaking in their natural environment. And so I think this kind of work sort of reinforces the idea that we need to be thinking about this kind of discourse in our classrooms. So there's a couple of questions here. Some of them are clarification questions. So the first one is, could you talk a little bit about the native speakers in your subject pool? Did they have similar academic experience or training, similar levels of education as your graduate and undergraduate students?
Do you want to take that one, Yoko?
Okay, so they were of a similar academic level, so they are college graduates, and yes.
Okay, and then a couple questions related to the actual discourse markers that you saw. There's one question from Marlene about whether you took into consideration variation in discourse markers in terms of the language variety that was spoken by the, particularly the L1 speaker, but also potentially the L2 speakers who may have been exposed to one variety of Spanish over another. And then a related question is whether or not you consider Aja, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, as a discourse marker in Spanish, and if that was something that came up in your data.
So yeah, so with the dialect considerations, that was patterns we saw, and we didn't discuss it in the presentation, but for example, our native speaker from Mexico, from northern Mexico, used osea a lot. Now osea is found in lots of dialects, but it is characteristic of perhaps her native dialect speech. Osea meaning that is. Our native speaker from Spain says hombre a lot, which is man, or joder, which is an expletive. Things that are characteristic of Spain's speech. We had our Cuban speaker says imagínate tú, and I've never heard imagínate tú, which means imagine that, but that's, I believe, very typical of Caribbean speech. So it is, and it's discourse markers are, it's not only dependent on the communicative interaction, but it depends on your idiolect. It depends on what makes sense for you. And we have, some of our graduate students. We have one graduate student in particular who emulates a peninsular Spanish dialect, and he as well says hombre, he says joder, he says these things, and that's not necessarily due to the interaction or due to his interlocutor. It's because it's an identity marker for him, and it's something that has become part of his idiolect as a discourse marker that he feels comfortable using. In terms of aha, yes, so we would consider it a discourse marker, and we have the multiple spellings. I mean, because it's similar to the English UH, if you want to spell it that way. So yes, it is. So Spanish speakers, and we have that spelling just because that's how we've seen it spelled in Spanish, but it's the same idea. It signals acceptance and agreement, or aha. So yeah.
I'm saying right here while you're saying that. So yeah. Okay, so there's one more question in the chat I want to address. So the question is from Kristen, and she is curious to know if there are studies that look at the use of discourse markers in speaking versus writing, or in interpersonal, that is spontaneous speech, versus presentational or prepared speech.
I can't really name the authors or articles, but we have seen some so development of discourse marker usage in writing, right? But there's less about speaking. Is that correct, James?
Yes, specifically in Spanish, those studies by Fernandez are the ones that I am cognizant of. I think if we look into other language pairs, they're usually English and X language. I do believe there is more diversity in oral and written. And then of course in written, you're looking at, what are we looking at? We're looking probably more at connectors, at information structures, things that are more formal. Yeah.
So I have a question that kind of popped up when you were talking about the one undergraduate student who said he used pero-like or something like that as a discourse marker. So I was curious if you were thinking about expanding this study in any way, and if you were thinking about the utility of doing stimulated recall with participants to sort of first see, okay, what markers do you think you use, and then see how they react to the markers that they actually use, because we're typically not aware of what we do when we're speaking, and we often report that we do certain things that we may or may not do depending on the context. And so I'm just curious if that was something that was of interest to you, and if you were thinking about expanding the study in any way moving forward.
Yeah, since it's been a while since we recorded the first conversation for undergraduate students, so it might be difficult for them to remember the conversation, but the recent one, we might be able to like reach out to them and see, have them listen to some of the examples of discourse markers and point out and, I don't know, give explicit feedback type of thing that may be beneficial for them. And yes, we would like to include that in the future study.
So are you planning on expanding the study?
Yes, I think that would be very beneficial to like to compare their own perception and their actual utterances, right? So yeah, we would love to do that.
Well, thank you. We have reached the top of the hour, and so we want to thank everybody for attending today and for your questions and comments in the chat. And we particularly want to thank Yoko and James for sharing this study with us. I'm excited to see how it progresses if you end up pursuing this in the future. And hopefully if you do, you can give another talk at CARLA. So thank you so much for being here and for being two of our graduate research assistants last summer. And thanks to all of you. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you at our next talk in November.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.